I didn't find out my husband was cheating through a rumor, a late-night confession, or a suspicious message. I found out while he was still texting me. "I'm working late. Crazy night. Happy anniversary, Nicole. I'll make it up to you." I remember staring at those words, my thumb hovering over the screen, trying to decide if I felt disappointed or just tired. It wasn't the first time Joshua had missed something important. His job as an architect demanded long hours, tight deadlines, endless revisions. That's what I had always told myself. That's what I had always believed. But something about the message felt off. Too quick. Too neat. Like it had been written, without thinking. I read it again. Then I looked up. And there he was. Not across the restaurant. Not hidden behind a pillar, or tucked into a private booth. Just a few feet away from me. Joshua stood near the bar, his back slightly turned, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months. Not the polite laugh he gave at dinner parties. Not the distracted smile he gave me when he was checking emails at the same time. This was real, easy, effortless. His hand rested on a woman's waist like it belonged there. Sarah, 33, sharp, composed. The kind of woman who always knew exactly what to say in a room full of people. I had met her twice before, once at a charity event, once at brunch. I remembered how she had complimented my dress, how she had smiled at me like we shared some unspoken understanding. I remember thinking she seemed trustworthy. I couldn't move. It was like my body had forgotten how. I watched as Joshua leaned closer to her, saying something I couldn't hear over the soft jazz music filling the restaurant. She laughed, placing her hand lightly against his chest. And then he kissed her. Not a mistake. Not hesitation. Not confusion. A kiss that had intention behind it, familiarity, practice. I was close enough to see the way his eyes closed. Close enough to know this wasn't new. Something inside me cracked so quietly I almost missed it. For a second, I told myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing, that there had to be an explanation. That maybe this was some kind of greeting, some cultural habit, something harmless I didn't understand. But no one kisses like that by accident. My chair scraped softly against the floor as I shifted forward. I didn't even realize I had started to stand until the blood rushed to my head and the room tilted slightly. I was going to walk over there. I was going to say his name loud enough for everyone to hear. I was going to look him in the eye and make him explain, make both of them explain how they thought they could do this right in front of me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care. I wanted them to see me. I wanted to see the moment their faces changed. I wanted the truth. But just as I took a step forward, a hand closed gently around my wrist. "Don't." The voice was calm, low, certain. I turned, startled, my breath catching halfway in my throat. A man stood beside me. I hadn't noticed him before, which made no sense because he wasn't the kind of person you overlooked. Mid-30s, maybe older. Clean, composed, eyes that didn't miss anything. He wasn't looking at me the way strangers usually do, curious, awkward, intrusive. He was looking at me like he had been expecting this moment. "Let go of me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't tighten his grip, but he didn't release me either. Just enough pressure to stop me from moving forward. "If you walk over there right now," he said quietly, "you're going to ruin your only advantage." I blinked at him, anger flaring through the shock. "My advantage?" I repeated. "That's my husband." "I know," he said. The way he said it steady, almost patient, made something twist in my chest. I pulled my wrist free this time, more forcefully. "Then you know exactly why I should be over there." He finally looked away from me, just for a second, his gaze flicking toward Joshua and Sarah, who were still laughing, still completely unaware. Then he looked back at me. "And you still don't understand what you're looking at," he said. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. "I understand perfectly," I snapped. "He's cheating on me." "If that's all this was," he replied just as calm as before, "I wouldn't have stopped you." The words didn't make sense. Not immediately. But they didn't feel like a lie either. I hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, I realized something that scared me more than the kiss, more than the betrayal, more than anything I had seen since walking into that restaurant. This man wasn't surprised. He had known. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice lower now, more controlled. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, just enough that no one else would hear him over the music. "Someone who knows what your husband is really doing," he said. I glanced back at Joshua again, at the way his hand lingered at Sarah's waist, at the ease in his posture, at how normal he looked, how comfortable. Then I looked back at the stranger. "Then tell me," I said. He studied my face for a moment, like he was deciding something, and then he shook his head slightly. "Not here," he said. "Not like this." My chest tightened. "You don't get to decide that." "I do," he said quietly, "because if you confront him now, you'll lose more than just your marriage." The words landed harder than they should have. Lose more. I felt my pulse in my throat again, but this time it wasn't just anger driving it. It was something else. Something colder. I looked back one last time at Joshua and Sarah, at the life I thought I had, playing out just a few feet away from me like a lie I had been too blind to see. Then I looked at the man standing beside me. "Start talking," I said, because for the first time since I had read that message, I wasn't just thinking about what my husband had done. I was starting to wonder what I didn't know. I didn't sit down because I was calm. I sat down because my legs couldn't hold me anymore. The chair felt colder than it had a minute ago, the soft candlelight suddenly too bright, too exposing. My eyes kept drifting back to Joshua and Sarah, like I was stuck in a loop I couldn't break. Every time I looked, they were still there, still laughing, still close, still real. "You need to stop looking at them like that," the man beside me said quietly. I didn't turn to him. "Like what?" "Like you're about to give yourself away." That made me look at him. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice lower now, tighter. "And how do you know anything about my husband?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, as if this was just another conversation to him, something ordinary. "How long have you felt something was off?" he asked. The question hit me harder than it should have. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said quickly. He didn't react. Late nights, missed calls, being there, but not really there. My fingers tightened around my phone. Joshua's text still glowed on the screen. "Working late. Happy anniversary." "I told you," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He's busy. His job is not what kept him away tonight." I swallowed, irritation rising. "I already know that. I just watched him kiss someone else." "If that's all you think this is," he said, "you're about to make a very expensive mistake." I turned to him fully now. "Stop talking in riddles." For the first time, his expression shifted just slightly. Not softer. Not friendlier. Just more direct. "This isn't just an affair," he said. I let out a short, humorless breath. "You don't say." "I'm serious." "So am I. I saw it. That's enough." "No," he said calmly. "It's not." Something about the way he said it, so certain, so controlled, made the anger in my chest falter just enough for something else to slip in. Doubt. "What are you trying to say?" I asked. He glanced toward Joshua again, then back at me. "I'm saying your husband didn't just lie to you tonight," he said. "He's been lying to you for a long time, and not just about her." My stomach tightened. "Then about what?" I demanded. He studied me for a moment, like he was measuring how much I could handle. "Your father's company," he said. The words didn't register at first. "What?" I asked. "Carson Holdings," he continued. "You're listed as a secondary stakeholder. Your father still controls most of it, but you're part of the structure." I stared at him. "How do you know that?" He ignored the question. "There's been unusual activity around it," he said. "Quiet. Controlled. the kind of movement most people wouldn't notice until it's too late. My pulse picked up again, but this time it had nothing to do with Joshua and Sarah. "You're wrong," I said automatically. "If something like that was happening, my dad would know." "Would he?" the man asked. I opened my mouth to respond, then hesitated. My father had mentioned stress recently. Long meetings. Something about market pressure, but he hadn't gone into detail. I hadn't pushed. I trusted that he had everything under control. Just like I had trusted Joshua. "No," I said more firmly, shaking my head. "You don't understand. My husband has nothing to do with that." "He has access," the man replied. "To what?" "To information. To timelines. To the kind of internal data people underestimate until someone uses it against them." "That's ridiculous," I said, though the conviction in my voice was slipping. "Is it?" he asked. "You think it's a coincidence he's spending more time at work? That he suddenly has projects that require late nights, off-site meetings, private calls?" "He's an architect," I snapped. "That's what they do." "Not like this." I clenched my jaw. "You don't know him." He held my gaze steadily. "I know enough." The silence between us stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. I looked back at Joshua again. He was leaning closer to Sarah now, his hands still at her waist, his posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. She said something that made him laugh, and for a second, I forgot to breathe. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't new. "How long?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Long enough," he said. I turned back sharply. "Then why are you telling me this?" That was the first time he hesitated. "Because you're the only one who can stop what's about to happen," he said. I stared at him. "Stop what?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "there's going to be a move. A coordinated one. Fast, precise, and quiet. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it'll already be done." A cold weight settled in my chest. "What kind of move?" I asked. "The kind that shifts control," he said. "The kind that turns ownership into leverage." I shook my head slowly. "You're saying my husband is somehow involved in taking over my father's company?" "I'm saying he's part of a plan that will make your father lose control of it." The words hit harder than I expected. "That's insane," I said. "But it came out weaker this time." "Is it?" he asked. "Or does it explain a lot more than you're ready to admit?" I looked down at my phone again. "Working late. Happy anniversary." My chest tightened. "If you walk over there right now," he continued, "you'll get your answer. He'll lie. You'll react. And whatever they're planning, it keeps moving forward." I swallowed. "And if I don't?" I asked. He met my eyes. "Then you might actually have a chance to stop it." The restaurant noise faded into the background. The music, the voices, the clinking glasses, it all blurred into something distant and unreal. All I could hear was my own heartbeat. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" I asked. He reached into his jacket, then paused, as if reconsidering. "First," he said, "you need to stop thinking like a wife." My stomach dropped. "And start thinking like someone who's about to lose everything." I looked at Joshua one more time. At the man I thought I knew. Then I looked back at the stranger. "Show me," I said. Because for the first time since I sat down at that table, I wasn't thinking about confronting him anymore. I was thinking about what would happen if I didn't. I didn't cry. That was the first thing I noticed as I sat there, staring at my husband across the room with another woman's hand resting on his chest. I thought I would break. I thought I would shatter right there in the middle of that restaurant, make a scene, demand answers, force the truth out into the open. But I didn't. Instead, something colder settled in. I slowly lowered myself back into the chair, my movements, careful, controlled, like any sudden motion might give me away. My fingers curled around the edge of the table, grounding myself in something solid while everything else felt like it was slipping. "You're making the right choice," the man beside me said quietly. I didn't look at him. "I don't even know what choice I'm making," I replied. "Yes, you do." My eyes drifted back to Joshua again. He leaned in closer to Sarah, his voice low, his expression relaxed. He looked happy, like nothing in the world was wrong, like I didn't exist. A part of me still wanted to stand up and walk over there, to say his name, to watch the color drain from his face when he realized I had seen everything. I imagined it for a second. The confrontation, the silence, the shock. And then what? He would lie. Or worse, he would admit it and twist it into something else, something that made sense only to him. And whatever this man beside me was talking about, whatever was coming tomorrow, I would lose my chance to stop it. "How do you know all this?" I asked finally, turning toward him. He was watching me like he had been waiting for that question. "I've been following a pattern," he said. "Your husband and Sarah aren't careful enough. They think no one's paying attention." "And you are?" I asked. "I was," he corrected. "Now you are too." That didn't answer anything. "Why me?" I pressed. "Why tell me instead of going to the police, or—" "Because you're the only one who can get close enough without raising suspicion." I let out a breath that almost turned into a laugh. "You don't know that." "I do," he said simply. I studied him, trying to read something, anything, in his expression. But there was nothing obvious there. No panic. No hesitation. Just quiet certainty. "You said this isn't just an affair," I said. "Then what is it exactly?" He tilted his head slightly. "Let me ask you something first. When did your husband's behavior start to change?" I opened my mouth to dismiss the question again, but stopped. Because I knew. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. "A few months ago," I said slowly. "Maybe longer? Late nights?" "Yes." "Phone always face down?" I nodded. "More protective of his schedule? His emails?" Another nod. "More distant," he added, "even when he's physically there." I swallowed. "Yes." He leaned back slightly. "That's not just someone having an affair." "What is it then?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "It's someone managing two lives," he said, "and doing it carefully." I shook my head, even as something inside me tightened. "That doesn't prove anything." "No," he agreed, "but it explains why you didn't see it." I looked down at my hands. They were steady now, too steady. "You said this has happened before," I said. "What did you mean by that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched Joshua again, then looked back at me. "People like him don't start with something this big," he said. "They build up to it." My chest tightened. "What are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying this might not be the first time he's done something like this," he replied. "That's not possible," I said immediately. But even as I said it, memories started surfacing. Projects Joshua had been involved in that ended abruptly, clients who disappeared, deals he never fully explained. At the time, I had trusted him. Now, I wasn't sure what I had been trusting. "You don't know him," I said again. But the words felt weaker now. "Maybe not the way you thought you did," he said. I closed my eyes for a second, pressing my fingers lightly against my temple. This was too much. Too fast. My husband was cheating on me. That was already more than I could process. But this idea that he was involved in something bigger, something calculated, it didn't fit. And yet, it did. In a way that made everything worse. "I need proof," I said finally, opening my eyes. "You'll get it," he said. "Not later. Not eventually. Now." He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You're starting to think the right way." That's not an answer. It's the only one you need right now. Frustration flared again. "You're asking me to trust you without telling me who you are." "I'm asking you to trust what you've already seen," he said. I looked back at Joshua, at the way his hand still hadn't moved from Sarah's waist, at the ease between them, the familiarity, the lie. Then I looked at my phone again. Working late. Happy anniversary. My stomach twisted. "What do I do?" I asked quietly. "For tonight?" he said. "Yes." "You go home," he replied. You act like nothing happened. The idea made something inside me recoil. I don't think I can do that. You can, he said, because you don't have a choice. I shook my head. You don't understand. I have to look at him, talk to him, pretend. Yes, he cut in gently. You do. I stared at him. And if I don't? I asked. Then you lose your only advantage, he said. Right now, he thinks you know nothing. The moment that changes, everything becomes harder. I exhaled slowly, the weight of it settling over me. He was right. I hated that he was right. So I just go home, I said. And pretend my husband didn't just kiss another woman in front of me. For now, he said. And then you find the truth, he replied. I looked at Joshua one last time. At the man I had built my life with. The man who had just destroyed it. And I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I wasn't looking at my husband anymore. I was looking at a stranger. Okay, I said finally. The word felt heavier than it should have. He gave a small nod. Good. I stood up slowly this time, making sure not to draw attention. I kept my head down as I walked past the tables, past the soft glow of the candles, past the life I had thought I was living. I didn't look at Joshua again. I couldn't. When I stepped outside, the night air hit me like a shock, cold and real. I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down. Joshua. Heading home soon. I'm sorry about tonight. I love you. For a moment, my vision blurred. I used to believe those words. I used to trust them. Now they felt like part of something else entirely. Something calculated. Something dangerous. My fingers hovered over the screen. Then I typed back. It's okay. I understand. See you at home. I hit send before I could change my mind. And as the message disappeared, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I had just lied to him. For the first time. And somehow, it didn't feel wrong. The house had never felt this quiet before. I closed the front door behind me and stood there for a second, listening to nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the hallway clock. It was the same house I had walked into 1,000 times, the same polished floors, the same framed photos on the wall, the same soft lighting. Joshua always insisted on leaving on at night. But something was different. It felt staged, like a set I had been living in without realizing it. I placed my keys gently on the console table, careful not to make too much noise, even though there was no one there yet. My movements were slow, deliberate, as if I were already being watched. I wasn't sure why that thought crossed my mind, but it stayed. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, folding my hands in my lap. The cushion sank slightly under my weight, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Across from me, the television screen reflected my face, pale, composed, almost unrecognizable. I didn't look like a woman who had just watched her husband kiss someone else. That scared me more than anything. I glanced at the clock. 10 minutes. Then 15. Then 20. Every second stretched longer than the last. I kept replaying it in my head, the message. The way he had walked into the restaurant. The way his hand had settled on Sarah's waist, like it belonged there. The kiss. My fingers tightened together until my knuckles turned white. I inhaled slowly, forcing the image away. I needed to stay focused. I needed to remember what the man Liam had said. If I confronted Joshua now, I would lose my advantage. So I sat there and waited. When I finally heard the sound of the front door unlocking, my entire body tensed instinctively. I forced myself to relax before he stepped inside. The door opened. "Hey!" Joshua called casually, like nothing in the world had changed. I turned my head just enough to look at him. He looked exactly the same. Same coat, same relaxed posture, same familiar face. If I hadn't seen what I had seen, I would have believed him. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, tossing his keys into the bowl with a soft clink. His eyes moved over me quickly, almost too quickly. "You're still up," he said. "I was waiting," I answered. A small pause. "Yeah," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry about tonight. It got crazy at the office." I held his gaze. "Crazy how?" I asked. The question came out softer than I expected, but it landed exactly where I wanted it to. He didn't hesitate, at least not at first. "Client issue," he said. "Last-minute changes. You know how it is." I nodded slowly, as if I understood. "I guess I do." He walked into the room, setting his bag down near the chair. His movements were smooth, practiced. Too practiced. "How was dinner?" he asked. "It was fine," I said, quiet. He smiled faintly. "I'll take you out this weekend. Somewhere nice. Make it up to you." I studied his face, searching for something, anything that would give him away. But he was good. Better than I had ever realized. "That sounds nice," I said. He stepped closer, resting his hand lightly on the back of the couch behind me. I felt the heat of him before I even registered the movement. "You're not mad?" he asked. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. I tilted my head slightly. Should I be? His eyes searched mine, just for a fraction of a second too long. "I don't know," he said. "You've seemed distant lately." The irony almost made me laugh. "I've just been tired," I replied. "Yeah," he said, nodding. "Me too." He moved around the couch and sat beside me, close enough that I could feel his shoulder brush against mine. I didn't move away. That was the hardest part. He reached for my hand, his fingers closing around mine like they had done 1,000 times before. Warm, familiar. Wrong. I forced myself not to react. "How was your day?" he asked. "Normal," I said. "Anything interesting happen?" I shook my head. "Not really." I could feel him watching me now, more carefully than before. Testing. Measuring. So I did the same. "Did you get a lot done?" I asked. "At work?" he said. "Yes." "Yeah," he answered. "More than I expected, actually." I held his gaze. "That's good." There was a pause. Small, subtle. But it was there. He squeezed my hand slightly, then let it go, leaning back into the couch. "I'm going to take a quick shower," he said. "Long day." "Of course," I replied. He stood, stretching his shoulders before heading toward the hallway. Just before he disappeared, he glanced back at me. "Hey," he said. "Yes?" "I love you." The words landed differently now. Not warm, not reassuring. Calculated. "I love you too," I said. He watched me for another second, then nodded and walked away. I waited until I heard the bathroom door close. Then the water start running. Only then did I move. Slowly, carefully, I stood up and walked toward the hallway, stopping just before the corner. The sound of the shower masked everything else, steady and loud. This was my chance. My eyes shifted toward his office door. Closed. Unlocked. I hesitated for half a second. Then I pushed it open. The room smelled faintly like hymn wood, paper, something sharp and clean. Everything was exactly where it always was. Desk organized, files stacked neatly. Nothing out of place. Too perfect. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. My heart was pounding again, but it felt different this time. Not panic. Focus. I moved toward his desk, scanning quickly. Papers. Sketches. Nothing obvious. Then I noticed his phone charger on the side table. No phone. Of course. He had taken it with him. Smart. I turned slightly, my gaze drifting across the room until it landed on his bag. The one he had dropped earlier. I approached it slowly, crouching down as I unzipped the top compartment just enough to peek inside. Folders. A tablet. Receipts. Then something else. A folded document tucked between two files. I slid it out carefully, unfolding it just enough to read the top line. My breath caught. It wasn't just numbers. It was structured. Organized. Planned. Before I could read more, a sound cut through the air. The water stopped. My entire body froze. Footsteps. Closer. I folded the paper quickly, slipping it back into the bag just as the hallway floor creaked. My heart slammed against my ribs as I stood, forcing myself to move naturally, casually, like I had every right to be there. The office door opened behind me. "What are you doing in here?" Joshua's voice was calm. Too calm. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "Just looking for a pen," I said. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there, watching me. And for the first time since I walked into that restaurant, I realized something else. This wasn't just about what I knew. It was about how long I could pretend I didn't. Joshua didn't answer right away. He just stood there, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, watching me like he was trying to decide something. The silence stretched longer than it should have, thick enough to make my pulse spike again. "A pen?" he repeated finally. I nodded, forcing a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Yeah, mine ran out earlier, and I thought you might have one in here." His eyes flicked briefly to the desk, then back to me. "You could have asked," he said. "I didn't want to bother you while you were in the shower." Another pause. Then, slowly, he stepped into the room. "Top drawer," he said, gesturing toward the desk. I moved toward it, aware of every step, every breath. I opened the drawer and pretended to search for a second before pulling out a pen. "Thanks," I said, holding it up slightly. He nodded, but he didn't leave. I could feel it now, something different in the air. Not just tension, suspicion. "You've been in here long?" he asked. "Just a minute," I replied, closing the drawer. I couldn't find anything in the kitchen. He watched me for another second, then gave a small shrug. "All right." But he still didn't move. I forced myself to walk past him, steady, controlled, resisting the urge to look back. When I reached the hallway, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That was close," I whispered to myself. But close wasn't enough anymore. I needed more than a glimpse. I needed proof. I returned to the living room and sat down again, the pen still in my hand. The house felt tighter now, like the walls had shifted inward while I wasn't looking. From down the hall, I heard Joshua moving around again. Closet doors, footsteps, normal sounds. Too normal. I stared at nothing for a moment, replaying what I had seen in his bag. The document hadn't looked like anything I recognized. Not personal, not work in the way he usually described it. Structured, intentional, and hidden. My grip tightened around the pen. That wasn't enough. If what Liam said was true, if there was something happening tomorrow, then whatever I had just seen was only a fraction of it. There had to be more. I closed my eyes briefly, thinking. Then I remembered. The safe. Joshua's safe. He didn't use it often, at least not in front of me. It was tucked away in the back of our bedroom closet, behind a panel most people wouldn't notice unless they knew exactly where to look. I had never asked about it. Never needed to. Until now. My heart started racing again, but this time it wasn't panic. It was decision. I stood up slowly and walked toward the bedroom, listening carefully. The bathroom door opened, then closed again. More movement. Good. I slipped into the bedroom and went straight to the closet, pulling the door open as quietly as possible. Everything inside was exactly as it always had been. Shirts pressed neatly, shoes lined up. Order. Control. I reached toward the back panel, my fingers brushing along the edge until I felt the slight shift in the wood. I pressed gently, and it gave way just enough to reveal the small metal safe behind it. I hesitated. This was a line I had never crossed before. Not even close. But then I saw it again, in my mind, Joshua's hand on Sarah's waist, the way he had looked at her, the way he had kissed her like it was second nature. The hesitation disappeared. I crouched down in front of the safe, staring at the keypad. 4 digits. Simple. Or not. I tried the obvious first. Our anniversary. The keypad beeped sharply. Incorrect. I swallowed and tried his birthday. Another beep. Still wrong. My pulse quickened. Think. I closed my eyes for a second, forcing myself to focus. If he didn't use something obvious, then it had to mean something to him. Something recent. Something important. I thought about the past few months, the late nights, the changes, the distance. And then it hit me. A date he had mentioned once, casually, in passing. Something about a big project milestone. I entered the numbers slowly. For a split second, nothing happened. Then I heard the soft click. My breath caught. The door unlocked. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling just slightly now. Inside, everything was arranged neatly. Folders, documents, a small black case, and a slim flash drive tucked into the corner. This wasn't chaos. This was a system. I pulled out the top folder and opened it quickly, scanning the pages. Numbers. Transactions. Company names I didn't recognize. But one name stood out immediately. My father's company. My stomach dropped. I flipped through more pages, faster now. The same name kept appearing, tied to different entities, different accounts, different movements. This wasn't random. This was targeted. I reached for the flash drive next, hesitating only for a second before slipping it into my laptop, which I had brought with me without even realizing I would need it. The screen lit up, and files appeared instantly. Organized. Labeled. Precise. I clicked on one. A timeline. Dates, actions, triggers. Everything aligned with what Liam had said. Tomorrow morning. Something was going to happen tomorrow morning. My chest tightened as I opened another file. More details. More structure. More proof. This wasn't a guess. This was real. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. My name. Not in a casual mention. Not in passing. In a section labeled Risk. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath shallow. There were notes. Specific ones. About me. My habits. My routines. My reactions. And then a line that made everything else disappear. If subject becomes aware, initiate containment protocol. I stared at it, my mind struggling to catch up. Containment. Not confrontation. Not explanation. Containment. I scrolled further, my fingers barely responding. More notes. Strategies. Ways to discredit me. Isolate me. Undermine me. Even references to mental instability. My stomach twisted. They weren't just planning something around me. They were planning for me. Planning to remove me. A sound in the hallway snapped me back to reality. Footsteps. Closer. I yanked the flash drive out, my heart slamming against my ribs as I shoved everything back into place as quickly as I could. Folder, case, drive. All of it back into the safe. I closed the door, pressing the panel back into place just as the bedroom door opened. Nicole? Joshua's voice. Right behind me. I stood up slowly, forcing myself to turn around. Yeah? I said. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. What are you doing in here? For a second, I almost told the truth. Almost. Then I smiled. Looking for something to wear tomorrow, I said. He watched me carefully. And in that moment, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. If he found out what I had just seen, this wouldn't just be about betrayal anymore. It would be about survival. Joshua didn't blink. He stood in the doorway, one shoulder slightly angled, watching me in a way that made the room feel smaller. I could still feel the phantom weight of the safe behind me, the files, the words I couldn't unsee. Containment protocol. My heartbeat slowed, not because I was calm, but because something inside me had locked into place. I couldn't sleep, I said, keeping my tone light. I thought I'd pick out something for tomorrow so I don't have to think in the morning. He held my gaze a second longer, then stepped inside. Tomorrow? He asked. School, I said. Parent conferences. You know how it gets. He nodded, but his eyes didn't leave my face. You're up late for that. I waited for you, I said, then shrugged. Couldn't switch off. A pause. Yeah, he said softly. Me neither. He moved past me toward the closet, close enough that I caught a faint trace of his cologne, the same one he'd worn to the restaurant, the same one that clung to him when he leaned into her. I didn't move. He reached for a shirt, took it down, then turned back toward me. You okay? He asked. There it was again. The question that sounded simple and meant everything. I'm fine, I said. He studied me, searching for something cracks. Maybe. Proof. Then he nodded, as if deciding to let it go. Try to get some rest, he said. I will. He stepped out of the room, the soft sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. I didn't move until I heard the bedroom door close. Only then did I let out a breath. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected shaking, panic, something messy and uncontrollable. Instead, there was a kind of clarity settling in, cold and sharp. I walked over to the bed and sat down, staring at the far wall. They had planned it. Not just the takeover. Not just the money. Me. Every move I made. Every reaction I might have. They had mapped it out like I was a variable in an equation they already knew how to solve. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, pressing my fingers into my temples. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't even betrayal in the way I had understood it an hour ago. This was strategy. And I was the problem they intended to eliminate. A part of me wanted to break right then. To cry, to scream, to run out of the house and never come back. But another part, the one that had kept me from standing up in that restaurant, the one that had opened the safe, was louder now. If I fell apart, I would lose. And losing didn't just mean losing Joshua. It meant losing everything. I closed my eyes and replayed the file again. Containment protocol. Discredit her. Isolate her. Question her mental stability. My stomach twisted. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to erase me. A small sound came from down the hall, a door opening, then closing again. Water running in the kitchen this time. Joshua moving around like everything was normal. Like we were normal. I straightened, my mind shifting gears. Emotion later. Now, I needed to think. I stood and walked quietly to my dresser, pulling out my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a second before I opened a new message. I didn't save his number. I didn't even know if I should. But I typed anyway. I saw enough. The reply came faster than I expected. Where are you? I glanced toward the door, listening. No footsteps. No movement nearby. Home, I typed. A pause. Then, are you alone? I looked at the door again. No. Another pause, longer this time. Then don't say anything else. Not there. My chest tightened. He knows something's off, I typed quickly. Of course he does, Liam replied. He's not careless. I swallowed. They have a plan for me, I wrote. If I find out. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately. I know. The words made something cold slide down my spine. You knew? I typed. I suspected, he replied. Now we're certain. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself to stay quiet, to breathe evenly. What do I do? I asked. This time, the response took longer. Nothing, he finally wrote. Not yet. My jaw tightened. That's not an option. It is if you want to survive this, he replied. Right now your advantage is that he doesn't know how much you know. I leaned back against the dresser, staring at the screen. I know enough, I typed. Enough to get yourself hurt, he said. Silence filled the room again, broken only by the faint sound of dishes in the kitchen. I closed my eyes. What happens tomorrow? I asked. Another pause. Then, they trigger the move when the market opens. And if I stop it? You don't stop it by confronting him, Liam replied. You stop it by understanding it. I opened my eyes, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same. But I wasn't. How? I asked. By going deeper, he said. You need more than what you saw tonight. My grip tightened around the phone. There's more? There's always more, he replied. I exhaled slowly. Then I'll find it, I said. Carefully, he added. One mistake, and you become the problem they planned for. I thought about the file again. About my name in that section. About how calm it all looked on paper. I already am the problem, I said. Another pause. Then, good. Now act like one they can't predict. The message lingered on the screen. I locked my phone and set it down. From the hallway, I heard Joshua's footsteps coming back toward the bedroom. I moved quickly, sliding under the covers just as the door opened. He stepped inside, turning off the light with a soft click before crossing the room. The mattress dipped as he lay down beside me. Did you pick something out? He asked casually. Yes, I said, keeping my voice soft. Good, he murmured. A few seconds passed. Then he added almost as an afterthought, tomorrow's going to be a big day. My eyes opened in the darkness. For you? I asked. For a lot of people, he said. I turned my head slightly, looking at his silhouette. Sounds important, I said. It is, he replied. Silence settled between us again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we weren't saying. I stared at the ceiling, listening to his breathing even out beside me. He thought he was in control. He thought I didn't know. And for now, that was exactly what I needed him to believe. I didn't sleep. I lay there beside him, eyes closed, breathing steady, listening to the rhythm of his breath like it belonged to someone else. At some point, it evened out deep, slow, unguarded. He slept easily. I didn't. Every time I drifted, the images came back. The kiss, the files, my name under risk, the word containment, echoing like a verdict already signed. So I stopped trying. By the time the sky outside the window turned pale gray, I was already sitting up, the blanket folded neatly over my legs, watching the room come into focus. Joshua stirred beside me, then rolled onto his back, blinking at the ceiling. Morning, he said, voice rough with sleep. Morning, I replied. He turned his head toward me, studying my face. You're up early. Couldn't sleep, I said. He nodded like that made sense. Big day. I held his gaze. You said that last night. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Did I? Yes. Then it must be true. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. For a second, he looked like the man I had married. Familiar. Ordinary. Then the feeling passed. He got out of bed, grabbing his phone from the nightstand, already scrolling. I watched him for a moment longer than I should have, memorizing the way he moved, the habits I had once found comforting. Now they felt like clues. I'll be out most of the day, he said, not looking up. Meetings. Of course, I said. He glanced at me then, just briefly. You'll be at school? Yes. Another nod. Another piece of the script. He disappeared into the bathroom, the door clicking shut behind him. I waited a few seconds, then reached for my phone. Where? I typed. The reply came almost instantly. 10 minutes. Same block. Coffee shop across from the pharmacy. I got up quietly and dressed quickly, choosing something simple, something that wouldn't stand out. I moved through the house like it was unfamiliar terrain, aware of every sound, every shift of light. When I stepped into the kitchen, Joshua was already there, pouring coffee. He looked up. You're leaving early. I have prep, I said. Students are behind. He handed me a mug. Don't work too hard. I won't. Our fingers brushed as I took it. The contact was brief, but it lingered longer than it should have. Drive safe, he added. You too. I set the mug down untouched and grabbed my bag. As I reached the door, he called after me. Nicole. I paused, turning back. Yeah? He hesitated for half a second. Nothing. Just text me when you get there. I nodded. I will. I didn't. The air outside was cool, sharp against my skin. I walked 2 blocks before slowing down, scanning the street the way Liam had taught me without ever saying it out loud. People, cars, reflections in windows. Nothing obvious. The coffee shop sat on the corner, small and quiet, with a line of early customers moving in and out. I stepped inside, ordered something I wouldn't drink, and took a seat near the back. He was already there. Not in the open. Near the window, angled so he could see both the door and the street. When our eyes met, he gave a slight nod. I carried my cup over and sat across from him. "You're late," I said. "You're early," he replied. I set the cup down, leaning forward. I opened the safe. I figured. And I found it. His expression didn't change. "What exactly did you find?" "My name," I said, in a section labeled Risk. A flicker of something crossed his eyes. Not surprise, confirmation. "What did it say?" he asked. "That if I find out they contain me," I held his gaze. "They're planning to discredit me, isolate me, make me look unstable." He exhaled slowly. "That fits." "Fits?" I echoed. "You say that like this is normal." "It is for people like him." I leaned back, folding my arms. "Then tell me exactly what kind of person my husband is." He watched me for a moment, as if deciding how much to give. "Someone who doesn't make emotional mistakes," he said. "Everything is calculated, including her." "Sarah," I said. He nodded. "She's part of it," I continued, "but she's not in charge." "No," he said. "She's leverage, access, not the architect." "That's Joshua," I said. "Yes." The word landed with a weight that made my chest tighten. "And you knew this?" I said. "I suspected," he corrected. "Now we're confirming." I looked down at the table, then back up. "You said this wasn't just about me." "It's not." "Then who else?" He hesitated. "That's not your immediate problem," he said finally. "It is if I'm in the middle of it," I shot back. "You are," he said. "But right now, you focus on what you can control." "Which is?" "Him. And her." I let out a breath. "I talked to her yesterday." His eyes sharpened slightly. "You confronted her?" "Not exactly," I said. "But I saw enough." "And?" She confirmed the timing. "Something happens this morning." "It will," he said. "Then we're out of time." He shook his head. "No, we're at the point where timing matters most." I leaned forward again. "Then tell me what I need." "A key," he said. I frowned. "What kind of key?" "Not physical," he replied. "Authorization. Access. Something that triggers the system they built." "And she has it?" "Most likely," he said. "Or she knows where it is." I stared at him. "Then we need to talk to her." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not simple." "It doesn't have to be," I said. "It just has to work." He studied me again. Longer this time. "You're changing fast," he said. "I don't have a choice." "No," he agreed, "you don't." Silence settled between us for a moment, heavy but focused. "If we do this," he said finally, "we do it carefully." "We don't have time for careful," I replied. "We don't have time for mistakes either." I held his gaze. "Where is she?" He didn't answer right away. Then he reached into his jacket and slid a small piece of paper across the table. I looked down at it. "An address." "She'll be there in an hour," he said. I picked it up, folding it once before slipping it into my bag. "And if this goes wrong?" I asked. He met my eyes. "It won't," he said. I almost smiled. "Everyone says that," I replied. I stood up, grabbing my cup as if I had somewhere normal to be. "Nicole," he said as I turned. I paused. "This is the point where most people walk away," he added. I looked at him over my shoulder. "I'm not most people," I said. And for the first time since I had sat down across from him, he didn't argue. I saw her before she saw me. She stood near the glass entrance of a sleek office building, phone in hand, posture straight, completely composed. If I didn't know better, I would have thought she was just another woman starting her workday. Not someone who had been kissing my husband less than 12 hours ago. I slowed my steps, watching her from across the street. Cars passed between us, people crossed without noticing either of us, and for a second, it almost felt unreal, like I had imagined everything. But I hadn't. Liam's voice echoed in my mind. You don't go to her as a victim. I crossed the street. She looked up just as I stepped onto the sidewalk, her eyes locking onto mine instantly. The recognition hit her first as surprise, then something sharper, more controlled. Nicole, she said. No hesitation. No confusion. Just my name. Sarah, I replied. We stood there for a moment, the space between us tight with everything we weren't saying. Up close, she looked exactly like I remembered. Polished, confident, put together. But now I could see it. The calculation. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. That's interesting, I replied, because I was just thinking the same thing about you. Her lips pressed together slightly, then relaxed. If this is about last night. It's not, I cut in. That caught her off guard. Just a flicker. Barely visible. But I saw it. Then what is it about? She asked. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough that no one passing by would hear. How long have you been working with him? I asked. Her expression didn't change immediately, but something in her eyes shifted. I don't know what you mean, she said. I almost smiled. You can stop pretending, I said. You're not bad at it, but you're not as good as you think. A beat of silence. Then she exhaled slowly. You shouldn't be asking these questions, she said. And you shouldn't be kissing someone else's husband in public, I replied. That one landed. Her jaw tightened just slightly. So you did see, she said. I saw enough. She looked past me for a second, scanning the street, then back at me. Then you already have your answer, she said. Whatever you think this is. It's bigger than that, I interrupted. This time the reaction was immediate. A flash of something fear, maybe before she shut it down. You don't know what you're talking about, she said. I know about the accounts, I said. The transfers. The timing. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharper now. Who told you that? I ignored the question. I know about the plan, I continued. I know something happens this morning. Her composure cracked. Just enough. And that was all I needed. You need to leave, she said, her voice lower now. Right now. Or what? I asked. You're in over your head, she replied. I let out a small breath. That's what everyone keeps telling me. And you're not listening, she said. No, I agreed. I'm not. Another pause. The air between us shifted again, something heavier settling in. This isn't just about you and Joshua, she said finally. You don't understand what you're stepping into. Then explain it to me, I said. She shook her head. I can't! Because you don't know, I pressed. Her eyes narrowed. I know enough. Not enough to be in control, I said. That hit. I saw it. The way her shoulders stiffened, the way her gaze sharpened just a fraction. You think you've figured everything out, she said. You haven't. I know you're not the one making decisions, I replied. I know that's him. Silence. Then, slowly, she let out a breath. You should walk away, she said, while you still can. I don't think that's an option anymore. No, she said quietly. It isn't. We stood there, the truth hanging between us in a way that didn't need to be said out loud. You're helping him destroy my family, I said. Her eyes flickered. It's not that simple. It never is, I replied, but it's still true. She looked away for a moment, her grip tightening slightly on her phone. You don't know what happens if this goes through, she said. Then tell me. I can't. Or you won't. Her gaze snapped back to mine. You're making this worse. For who? For you, she said. There it was again. Not anger. Not guilt. Fear. What happens at open? I asked quietly. She hesitated. Just long enough. That's not something you can stop, she said. So it is happening. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. You have something, I said. A key. Access. Something that makes it work. Her eyes widened just slightly before she masked it. You need to stop talking, she said. I'm getting close, I replied. You're getting yourself killed, she snapped. The word hung in the air longer than anything else she had said. Killed. Not ruined. Not exposed. Killed. My chest tightened, but I didn't step back. Then maybe you should help me instead, I said. She stared at me like I had just said something impossible. You don't get it, she said. There are people involved in this who don't care about you, about me, about anyone. I already figured that out. Then act like it. I am. A car pulled up to the curb behind her. Black tinted windows. Her eyes flicked toward it, just for a second. And that was when everything changed. Go, she said suddenly, stepping back. Now. Sarah. Go, she repeated, sharper this time. The passenger door of the car opened. A man stepped out. He didn't look at me. He looked at her. And that was enough. I felt it then. That shift. From tension to danger. I took a step back, my pulse picking up again. Sarah moved toward the car, then paused just long enough to look at me one last time. You should have stayed out of this, she said quietly. Then she got in. The door shut. The car pulled away without another word. I stood there, staring after it, my mind racing. A presence appeared beside me. You stayed too long, Liam said. I didn't look at him. They're watching, he added. I turned slightly, scanning the street. Everything looked normal. Too normal. She knows more than she said, I murmured. Yes, he replied. And so do they. I exhaled slowly, my hands steady again despite the surge of adrenaline. This isn't just about stopping them anymore, I said. No, Liam agreed. I watched the street where the car had disappeared. It's about surviving it, I finished. And for the first time since this started, I knew exactly how deep I was in. We walked without looking like we were walking away. Liam moved first. Not fast, not slow, just enough to blend into the late morning crowd. I fell in beside him half a step behind, matching his pace without thinking about it. Don't turn around, he said under his breath. I wasn't planning to. Good. The street felt different now, louder, sharper. Every reflection in every window seemed to hold a second version of us, and I couldn't tell which one was real. Who were they? I asked. Not the kind you want to meet twice. That doesn't answer anything. It answers enough, he said. Keep walking. We crossed at the light with a cluster of people. A bus pulled up, blocking the curb for a second. Liam used the moment to shift direction, guiding me toward a narrower side street. Are we being followed? I asked. Yes. The word landed clean and cold. How many? 2, maybe 3. Different positions. My chest tightened, but my steps stayed even. And you're sure? I don't guess, he said. We turned left. The noise dropped off immediately. Fewer people, fewer cars, too quiet. Stay close, he said. I did. A reflection caught my eye in a dark storefront window. A man in a gray jacket paused at the corner we had just passed, pretending to check his phone. Another figure moved on the opposite side of the street, slow, deliberate. They're not hiding it, I said. They don't need to, Liam replied. They just need to keep us in sight. Until what? Until they decide you're a problem worth solving. My mouth went dry. We kept moving. At the end of the block, Liam stopped abruptly and pulled open the door to a small convenience store. Inside, he said. I followed him in. The bell above the door chimed softly, the normalcy of it almost surreal. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A man behind the counter glanced up, then went back to his phone. Liam walked straight to the back aisle, then turned down another row, putting shelves between us and the windows. Wait here, he said. Where are you going? Creating noise. Before I could ask what that meant, he moved away, grabbing a bottle from a shelf, then another, heading toward the register. I stood there, forcing myself to breathe evenly, listening. The bell chimed again. Footsteps. A pause. I resisted the urge to look. Voices, low and indistinct, carried from the front of the store. The man at the counter spoke, then another voice answered, short, clipped. Liam's voice cut in, louder now, casual. "Hey, you take cards?" "Yeah," the clerk replied. "Good." I heard the rustle of a bag, the beep of a scanner. Normal sounds. Deliberately normal. Then Liam was back, moving past me without breaking stride. "Now," he said. We walked out together, blending into a group that had just entered. On the sidewalk, he didn't slow down. "Did it work?" I asked. "For now." I glanced at the reflection again. The man in gray was still there, but his focus had shifted, uncertain. "They lost us?" I said. "They lost certainty," Liam corrected. "That's enough." We turned another corner, then another, until the street widened and the crowd thickened again. Only then did he slow. "Talk," he said. I exhaled. "She's not in charge." "I told you." "She's scared," I added. "Not of me, of them." "Good." "Good?" I echoed. "It means pressure works." I shook my head. She said people are involved who don't care about anyone. She used the word killed. Liam's expression didn't change. "That tracks." "Stop saying that like it's normal." "For them, it is." I swallowed, steadying myself. She confirmed the timing. "Something triggers at open." "It already has," he said. My stomach dropped. "What?" "It doesn't start at the bell," he said. "It starts before. Pre-market positioning. Cued orders. By the time it's visible, it's moving." "Then we're too late." "No," he said. "We're at the point where intervention matters most." I rubbed my temples. "She has something. A key. Not physical authorization. I'm sure of it. Or she knows who does." "You think it's Joshua?" "I think Joshua controls the path," he said, "whether he holds the key or not." I looked at him. "Then I have to get back inside." "Yes." The word came too easily. "After what just happened?" I asked. "That's exactly why," he said. "They'll expect you to retreat. You don't." I let out a short breath. "You're asking me to walk back into a house where my husband is planning to erase me. I'm telling you that's where the leverage is." I stared at him. "And if he already suspects me?" "He does," Liam said. "Just not enough." "And when that changes?" "Then you move faster." I looked away, watching the flow of people, the normal rhythm of a city that had no idea what was happening beneath it. "This is insane," I said. "It's controlled," he replied. "Insane would be reacting without a plan." I almost laughed. That used to be my specialty. "Not anymore." Silence settled between us for a moment. "What am I looking for?" I asked. "A trigger," he said. "A device, a credential, something that authorizes the sequence. It could be digital, physical, embedded in something routine." "And if I find it?" "You don't use it," he said. "You hold it. You disrupt timing." I nodded slowly. "And you?" "I'll handle the outside," he said. I met his eyes. "I still don't know who you are." "You know enough," he replied. "That's what you keep saying. It's what keeps you alive." My phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down. "Joshua." "Where are you? Didn't get your text." I felt Liam's gaze on me. "Answer it," he said. I typed quickly. "Just got to school. Busy morning." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Another message came through. "Call me when you can." I stared at it. "He's pulling," Liam said quietly. "Testing." I locked the phone. "I won't call." "Not yet," he agreed. I slipped the phone into my bag, my mind already shifting ahead. "I go home," I said. "Yes." "I act normal." "Yes." "I find the key." He nodded. "And then?" I asked. "Then we take control." I drew a breath, letting it out slowly. Across the street, a car idled at the curb, dark windows reflecting the sky. For a second, I thought I saw movement inside. Maybe I did. "They're still out there," I said. They will be, Liam replied, until this is over. I squared my shoulders. Then let's finish it, I said. Because walking away wasn't an option anymore. Not when I knew exactly what I was walking back into. I knew he was watching me the second I walked through the door. It wasn't obvious. Joshua didn't jump up, didn't question me the moment I stepped inside. He stayed where he was in the living room, one arm resting along the back of the couch, phone in his hand like it had always been there. But his eyes lifted a fraction too quickly, and stayed on me a fraction too long. You're home early, he said. So are you, I replied, setting my bag down like nothing had changed. A small pause. Meeting got pushed, he said. Mine too. We held each other's gaze for a beat longer than necessary, both of us measuring something neither of us was willing to say out loud. Then he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. How was your morning? He asked. Busy, I said. You know how it is. I do, he said, tapping his phone once before setting it aside. Anything interesting happen? The question landed softer than it should have. No, I answered. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. Good, he said. I moved into the kitchen, opening the cabinet for no real reason other than to break the line of sight. My hands moved on their own glass, water, something to occupy them. Behind me, I heard him stand. Nicole, he said. I turned, leaning lightly against the counter. Yeah? You didn't text when you got to school. There it was. I kept my expression neutral. I got pulled into a meeting right away. It slipped my mind. He studied me again. Right, he said. Silence settled between us, thinner this time, stretched tight. He stepped closer, stopping just short of the counter. Close enough that I could see the shift in his breathing. You seem different, he said. How? I don't know, he admitted. Just off. I tilted my head slightly. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe. Another pause. Then he smiled again, softer this time. You should rest. I will. He nodded once, then turned away, walking back toward the living room. He didn't push. Not yet. But I felt it. The edge. I waited until he sat down again before moving, my steps quiet, controlled, as I made my way down the hallway toward his office. My pulse picked up, but it wasn't panic anymore. It was timing. He was alert, which meant I had to be better. I stopped just before the door, listening. Television on, low volume. The soft flick of his thumb against his phone screen. Distracted. Or pretending to be. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as I had left it. Too clean. Too organized. I closed the door behind me just enough to muffle sound, not enough to draw attention. Think. Liam's voice echoed in my head. A trigger. Authorization. Something routine. I moved to the desk first, scanning quickly. Papers, sketches, nothing new. I opened a drawer, pens, notebooks, nothing useful. Too obvious. I turned to the shelves. Files lined up in perfect order. Labels neat, precise. I ran my fingers along the edges, looking for anything that didn't belong. Nothing. Of course. He wouldn't leave it out. My gaze shifted to the corner of the room, to the place where he kept his bag. Empty. He had taken it. Smart. My jaw tightened. Think like him, I whispered. Control. Redundancy. Backup. I moved to the wall panel again, pressing it open to reveal the safe. I hesitated for half a second, then entered the code. Click. Inside, everything was exactly as before. Folders, documents. But this time, I wasn't looking for the obvious. I pulled everything out, placing it carefully on the floor, piece by piece, until the safe was empty. Nothing. For a second, frustration flared. Then I saw it. The lining. It wasn't quite flush. I reached inside, pressing along the back panel until it shifted slightly under my fingers. A hidden compartment. Of course. I slid my hand inside and felt something small, smooth. I pulled it out slowly. A thin black device. No markings. No screen. Light. Important. This is it, I murmured. My pulse steadied. This was the core. The thing everything depended on. I turned it over in my hand, studying it. No obvious input. No buttons, which meant it wasn't meant to be used casually. Authorization. Exactly like Liam said. A sound in the hallway froze me in place. Footsteps. Closer. Nicole? Joshua's voice. Too close. I moved fast. The device slipped into my sleeve, hidden against my wrist. I shoved the contents of the safe back in. Roughly. Not perfect, but enough. The panel slid shut just as the door opened. What are you doing? His voice was sharper now. I turned, forcing my breathing to stay even. I told you, I said, looking for something. His eyes flicked around the room, then back to me. You've been in here a lot today, he said. Have I? Yes. I shrugged lightly. Didn't realize I needed permission. A flash of something crossed his face. Annoyance. Suspicion. Then it was gone. You don't, he said. Just seems unusual. Maybe I'm reorganizing, I replied. Maybe. We stood there for a second, neither of us moving. Then I stepped past him, brushing his shoulder just enough to make it feel natural. You should get back to your meeting, I said. He didn't follow me right away. I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked down the hall, every step measured, every movement controlled. When I reached the living room, I stopped, turning just slightly. You said today was important, I said. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me. It is. Then don't let me distract you. A beat. Then he smiled. I won't. I nodded once and turned away, my fingers curling slightly around the edge of my sleeve. The device was still there, hidden. For the first time since this started, I felt something shift. Not fear. Control. Because whatever he had planned, I had just taken the one thing he needed to finish it, and he didn't even know it. I chose the hospital because it was the last place anyone would expect a confession. It was neutral, public, bright in a way that made shadows harder to hide, and it was close enough to everything that mattered without belonging to any of it. I texted him from the parking lot. We need to talk. Now. He didn't reply. He called. I let it ring twice, then answered. Where are you? He asked. St. Helena, I said. Main entrance. A pause. Not long. Just enough to tell me he was recalculating. I'll be there, he said, and hung up. I sat in my car for a moment longer, the device pressing lightly against my wrist under the sleeve of my jacket. It felt small, insignificant. It wasn't. Liam's message came through as I stepped out. I'm in position, don't rush it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Inside, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet decisions. People moved with purpose, voices low, eyes tired. No one looked at me twice. I took a seat near the far wall, angled so I could see the entrance and the elevators. The overhead lights hummed softly. Minutes passed. Then he walked in. Joshua didn't look surprised to see me. Not really. He looked focused. Like this was a meeting he had been preparing for without knowing the time or place. He crossed the lobby without hesitation and stopped a few feet in front of me. You said now, he said. I stood. Now works. We held each other's gaze, the noise of the hospital fading into something distant. You're not at school, he said. No. And you didn't text. No. A small exhale. Okay. No anger, no accusation. Just acceptance. Walk with me, I said, turning toward a quieter corridor. He followed. We stopped near a bank of empty chairs, the hallway stretching out on either side, no one close enough to hear. Say it, he said. What? Whatever you brought me here to say. I looked at him, really looked this time. At the man I had loved. At the man who had planned my removal like a line item. I know about Sarah, I said. He didn't react. I know about the accounts, I continued. The transfers, the timeline. A beat. I'm still nothing. And I know what happens at open. That got him. Not much, not a flinch. Just a narrowing of his eyes, a shift so small most people would have missed it. I didn't. You've been busy, he said. I had to catch up. He nodded once, almost approving. And what do you think you've caught? Enough. He studied me, and for the first time, he stopped pretending. The softness left his face. What do you want, Nicole? He asked. The truth. He almost smiled. That's not what people want, he said. They want reassurance. I don't. No, he agreed. You don't. Silence settled between us, heavy and clean. So, he said, tell me what you think is happening. You're positioning against my father's company, I said. Layered accounts, coordinated sell pressure. You tank the price, then buy back through shells. His gaze didn't waver. Go on. You use access you shouldn't have. You use her to move through systems you can't reach directly, and you time it so no one can react. A longer pause this time. Then he nodded. Not bad, he said. The words landed like a verdict. You're admitting it? I asked. I'm acknowledging that you've put together a version of it, he replied. And the rest? The rest doesn't change the outcome. I held his gaze. It does if I stop it. Another almost smile. Do you think you can? He asked. I think I already have. That was the moment. The first real crack. His eyes sharpened, something calculating sliding into place. What did you do? He asked. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch. He took a step closer. Nicole, your plan has a dependency, I said. A trigger. Something that authorizes the sequence. He didn't blink. You built everything around it, I continued. Control, timing, redundancy. And, he said, and you don't have it anymore. The words hung there, quiet and final. For a second, nothing moved. Then something changed in him. Not panic. Not fear. Adjustment. He stepped back, exhaling slowly. Interesting, he said. Is it? Yes, he replied. Because that means you found something you weren't supposed to. I find things when I look. I've noticed. He turned slightly, glancing down the hallway, then back at me. You think that ends it? He asked. I think it stops you. It delays me, he corrected. Not if I hold it. Another pause. Then his expression shifted again, something colder settling in. You shouldn't have done that, he said. I didn't have a choice. There's always a choice. Not when the alternative is being erased. That landed. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded once, slow. So you read that part, he said. I read enough. And you still came here. Yes. A flicker of something respect, maybe passed through his eyes. Then let me be clear, he said. You've complicated things. You haven't stopped them. I felt my grip tighten under my sleeve. Try me. He stepped closer again, his voice dropping. You don't understand the scale of this, he said, or the people behind it. I don't need to, I replied. I just need to stop you. You can't, he said. Watch me. For the first time, something like frustration surfaced. You always thought this was about us, he said. It's not. It never was. It was for me, I said. No, he replied. You were incidental. The word hit harder than anything else. Incidental. I let it pass. You planned for me, I said. We planned for risk, he corrected. You fit the profile. I exhaled slowly. And now? I asked. Now you've made yourself relevant. A beat. And that's dangerous. His hand moved slightly, not reaching, not grabbing, just shifting. Enough. Don't, I said. He stopped. We held there, the space between us charged, balanced on something fragile. Give it back, he said. No. You don't know how to use it. I don't need to. Another pause. Then he smiled again. Not warm. Not familiar. Just calculated. Then we're done talking, he said. From the far end of the hallway, footsteps approached. Measured. Intentional. Liam. Joshua's eyes flicked past me, registering the movement. That explains a lot, he said. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. You underestimated me, I said. No, he replied. I adjusted late. The footsteps stopped just behind me. The air shifted. And for the first time since he walked in, Joshua didn't know what would happen next. It ended quietly. Not with a scream. Not with a dramatic collapse. Not even with the kind of chaos I had imagined in my worst moments. Just quietly. Joshua didn't run. He didn't fight. He didn't deny anything anymore. When Liam stepped forward and the reality of the situation finally closed in around him, something in his posture shifted. Not defeat. Not regret. Acceptance. Like a man who understood exactly when the game had turned against him. You should have walked away, he said to me one last time. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time, I didn't feel anything pull inside my chest. No, I said. You should have. That was the last thing I ever said to my husband. After that, everything moved the way systems do when they've already been set in motion. Controlled. Measured. Unavoidable. Authorities were involved. Quietly, efficiently. Conversations happened behind closed doors. Names were mentioned. Documents surfaced. Patterns that had once been hidden became impossible to ignore. The plan didn't just fail. It collapsed. And with it, so did everything Joshua had built around it. I didn't watch most of it happen. I didn't need to. I already knew how it would end. A few days later, I sat across from my father in his office. The same office I had grown up running into after school. The same desk I had leaned against while he worked late nights. He looked older. Not weaker. Just aware. You stopped it, he said. We stopped it, I corrected. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable passing through his eyes. I didn't see it, he admitted. You weren't supposed to, I said. That was the point. A small nod. And Joshua? He asked. I shook my head slightly. He made his choices. That was enough. We didn't talk about it again after that. There wasn't anything left to say. Sarah disappeared from my world just as quickly as she had entered it. I heard things, of course. Consequences. Investigations. Names attached to actions they couldn't explain away anymore. But I didn't follow it. I didn't need closure from her. She had never been the one I trusted. That part had always belonged to him. And that was the part that took longer to understand. Longer to accept. It wasn't the betrayal itself that stayed with me. It was the realization of how long I had been standing inside it without seeing it. How easy it had been for someone I loved to turn my trust into something he could use. That was the part that changed me. Not overnight. Not all at once. But slowly, in ways I started to notice in the smallest moments. The way I listened more carefully. The way I questioned things I used to accept without thinking. The way I stopped explaining away discomfort just to keep the peace. I went back to work. Back to my classroom. Back to routines that felt almost foreign at first, then slowly became mine again. The students didn't know anything had changed. But I did. And that was enough. I wasn't the same woman who had sat in that restaurant waiting for her husband to show up. I wasn't the woman who believed a message without looking up. I wasn't the woman who thought love meant not asking questions. I had lost something, but I had gained something else. Clarity. And once you have that, it's hard to go back. A week later, I met Liam one last time. Same city. Different place. This time it was quiet on purpose. No pressure. No urgency. Just two people who had survived something most people never even see. You handled it well, he said. You expected me not to? I expected you to adapt, he replied. You did more than that. I let out a small breath. You still haven't told me who you are. He smiled slightly. Does it matter? It did, I said, at the beginning. And now? I thought about it. No, I said. Now I just know you were there when it counted. He nodded once, like that was enough. There are other situations like this, he said after a moment. Other people who don't see what's happening until it's too late. I looked at him. And you step in? I asked. Sometimes. And now you're offering me the same thing? I'm offering you a choice. I leaned back slightly, considering that. A week ago, I would have said no without thinking. Walk away. Start over. Forget everything. But now, I knew how close I had come to losing everything without even realizing it. Now I knew what it felt like to stand on the edge of something and not see it until it was almost too late. I don't know, I said honestly. You don't have to decide now, he replied. I nodded. We sat in silence for a moment, not uncomfortable, just complete. When I stood to leave, he didn't stop me. Nicole, he said. I turned. You didn't just survive this, he added. You changed the outcome. I held his gaze for a second, then nodded once. So did you, I said. And then I walked away. Not back to who I was, but forward to who I had become. Because the truth is, the biggest betrayal isn't always the cheating. It's the moment you realize someone you trusted has been quietly dismantling your life piece by piece, and you didn't see it. But here's the part no one tells you. You can rebuild. You can take control back. And sometimes, you can turn the tables in ways they never expected. So, if you've ever felt that moment, that doubt you couldn't explain, that feeling something wasn't right but you pushed it aside, I want to know. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted him right there in that restaurant? Or would you have waited? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and a little too close to the truth, stay with me. Because some stories don't end when the truth comes out. That's just where they begin. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.